Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Vax Facts. I'm Denise Johnson, Acting Physician General at the Pennsylvania Department of Health. Today, we're going to be answering your questions on vaccine safety. The COVID-19 vaccines are new, and so it's normal to have questions about them. With so much information and misinformation out there, access to reliable and trusted sources can help you make the best decision for you and your family. Joining me today is Dr. Paul Offit. He's the Chief of Infectious Diseases and Professor of Pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Offit's credentials are extensive. I am just going to mention a couple of highlights. Dr. Offit has published more than 160 papers in medical and scientific journals in the area of rotavirus-specific immune responses and vaccine safety. He's also the recipient of several prestigious book awards. He is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq, which has been recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC in 2006 and by the World Health Organization in 2013. Dr. Offit has received many international accolades for his work. Just a few notable ones are the Young Investigator Award in Vaccine Development from the Infectious Disease Society of America, the President's Certificate for Outstanding Service from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Humanitarian of the Year Award from the Biologics Industry Organization, the Edward Jenner Lifetime Achievement Award in Vaccinology, and so many more. We could probably spend a whole hour just listing them. Dr. Offit has also been a member of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices to the CDC and is currently a member of the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee and is a founding advisory board member of the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Offit.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. It's my pleasure. So I want to address a couple of things this morning that come up frequently. I think the first is, and this is highlighted by the recent full approval or licensure by the Food and Drug Administration for the Pfizer vaccine for those over 16 years of age. So people ask the question, what's the difference? What's the difference between an emergency use authorization, which is what this vaccine has been distributed under, versus full approval? Because many people, there was recently a Kaiser Family Foundation study trying to ask the question of those who haven't been vaccinated, what percentage are choosing not to be vaccinated because the vaccine hasn't been fully approved yet? And the answer was 3 out of 10. So in theory, 30% of those who are unvaccinated should now be lining up to get the vaccine. I'm a little skeptical of that. I think that people are just looking for reasons not to get it. And if they don't have that one, they'll come up with another one, but I hope I'm wrong. In any case, so let's go through that. What an emergency use authorization technically means is that a company is allowed to distribute a drug or a vaccine as an investigational new product. That's all that means. So for example, when the previous administration wanted hydroxychloroquine to be distributed under emergency use authorization, it was given emergency use authorization like last April. It was soon found that the hydroxychloroquine neither treated nor prevented COVID-19, and so then emergency use authorization was withdrawn. That sort of event scared people. It made people think that the reasons for giving or the strictness by which these products are being regulated was really lax, and that we were just sort of throwing products out there and hoping they worked. But that's not the way it's played out with vaccines. So the vaccine trials that were done, the 30,000 person trial of Moderna, the 44,000 person trial of Pfizer, the 40,000 person trial of J&J, was the size of any typical pediatric or adult vaccine trial. Similarly, the length of safety follow-up, which is 2 months after the last dose, is similar for any pediatric or adult vaccine, because all of the serious side effects that have occurred with vaccines typically occur within 6 weeks of a dose, have always occurred, frankly, within 6 weeks of a dose. The really only real difference in terms of these vaccine approvals that came last December and what would be a more typical, a fully approved vaccine was the length of follow-up for efficacy. I mean, when the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee recommended last December for the approval of these drugs or through emergency use authorization, we could say that they were effective for a few months, but we didn't know that they were effective for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years or 3 years. On the other hand, in the midst of a pandemic, you're not going to do a 2 or 3 or 4 year study to see how long efficacy lasts. You're going to assume that 95% efficacy is going to hold up for at least 6 months, a year or 2 years. And certainly we know that these vaccines, all of them, are sort of in the low 90% effective for protection against serious disease now, roughly 6 months or 7 months after they've been out there. So the only real functional difference, frankly, between emergency use authorization and full approval is that the FDA, when they fully license a drug, doesn't just license the product, they also license the process by which the product is made and the manufacturing site. And that is usually a lengthy procedure. What they need to do is they need to go through every single aspect of manufacture to look at the protocols and validate the protocols for every one of those aspects. Typically that takes about 10 months. If you get an expedited review, that can take 6 months. In this case, it took about 4 months. So they can now say that the manufacturing protocols are in place. But for people who were hesitant to get the vaccine, they should have been reassured by the fact that it's been given to half of the American population. So you have an enormous safety record on which to stand, an enormous efficacy record on which to stand. I mean, even very, very rare side effects like myocardial inflammation, which occurs maybe in as frequently as 1 in 20,000 people, or clotting associated with the J&J vaccine, which is close to about 1 in 500,000 people, or Guillain-Barré syndrome, roughly 1 in 120,000 people. There's very, very rare side effects have been picked up. And it should be pointed out also that the virus itself does all of those things at a much more frequent level. So a choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's just a choice to take a different and more serious risk. So I think people should be have been reassured by all of the data that we had before there ever was a full approval. But now that there's a full approval, hopefully there will be some people who will feel better about getting this vaccine. And I think also importantly, there are now a number of institutions and private groups in the private sector that are now more comfortable mandating the vaccine. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. So I'm going to start at the beginning for how VAERS was generated and why it was generated. So I think in many ways, the birth of the modern American anti-vaccine movement started on April 19th, 1982. It was associated with a 1-hour documentary that was released on NBC called DPT Vaccine Roulette. So DPT stands for diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, although technically it really should have been DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. But what that movie showed was it showed a series of children, all of whom had similar problems. They were seizing, they were drooling, they had bicycle helmets on, they had sort of withered arms and legs, they were staring vacantly up into the sky. And all the parents told the same story. This thing that's happened to my child, whether it's a seizure disorder or developmental delay, was all caused by the pertussis or whooping cough vaccine. They were sure of it because the child had been fine, had gotten the vaccine, and now they weren't fine. And that was really, in many ways, the birth of the modern American anti-vaccine movement. There was a group that was quickly formed called Dissatisfied Parents Together, or DPT, and they soon changed their name to the National Vaccine Information Center, which became the one-stop shop for frankly bad information about vaccines that was enormously influential in getting people to not vaccinate their children. But following that program, there was a flood of litigation against vaccine makers. And so because of that litigation, the vaccine makers were leaving the business. We went from 3 makers of the oral polio vaccine to 1. We went from 6 makers of the measles vaccine to 1. We went from 8 manufacturers of the pertussis or whooping cough vaccine to 1. And that 1 that was left literally was threatening to stop making the vaccine because to just defend themselves in the lawsuits, it wasn't worth it to them. So we were about to lose vaccines for American children. I mean, we went from 27 vaccine makers in 1955 to 18 by 1980 to 4 associated with all the litigation that was caused by that program, frankly. So the Reagan administration basically stood up and created in 1986 the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which included a number of things. It included the National Vaccine Program Office, the creation of that office. It also included something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which I'll get to in a second, and it included the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. So the way the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System works is that if your child had a problem with the vaccine that you think might have been related to the vaccine, then you basically just fill out a one-page form. When it was created, it was actually a physical one-page form. Now it can be filled out online, and you then submit it to the government. In this program, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System program, that is co-directed by the CDC and the FDA. But it's as we say euphemistically, a noisy system. Anybody can report. Parents can report, patients can report, doctors can report, nurses can report, personal injury lawyers can report, anybody can report. And and everything gets included. I mean, if you write a report that says my child got a vaccine and became the Incredible Hulk, and you write that in and you submit that to the program, that will not be deleted. It's all in there. So I think it is at its best a hypothesis generating system, because you're missing a critical component. What you're missing is, what you have is got a vaccine, had a problem. What you don't have is didn't get a vaccine and had the same problem. You need to have a control group in order to see whether or not something that seems to be occurring after vaccine is occurring more frequently in a vaccinated versus unvaccinated group. That's the only way you can determine whether or not something really is causally associated with the vaccine, right? I mean, the rooster crows, the sun comes up. The rooster crows, the sun comes up. Is the rooster causing the sun to come up? No, is the answer to that question. I don't think that study's ever been done, but I'm going to go out on a limb and saying that if you made it so the rooster couldn't crow, the sun would still come up. And that's what you need. Now, here's where VAERS has worked well. In the late 1990s, there was a rotavirus vaccine called RotaShield that was introduced onto the market. It was made by Wyeth. It was distributed to probably about 1 million people over a 10-month period. And then there were a number of reports to VAERS of something called intussusception, which is intestinal blockage, which can be severe and occasionally fatal. And so the question was, there was about 15 reports. What was worrisome about those reports is that they were all within a couple of weeks of getting the vaccine. They were all within a couple of weeks of getting the first dose of vaccine, which is what you would expect would be the more serious, more likely causal association. And it was occurring in 2-month-old and 3-month-old children who are not typically the ones that get intussusception. Intussusception is a disease of children that occurs primarily in the 5 to 9-month-old, not the 2-month-old. So that was worrisome. So in order to answer the question, was intussusception more common in a vaccinated versus unvaccinated group, something that the VAERS system cannot answer, that the researchers turned to the Vaccine Safety Data Link. There you have basically a linked, computerized medical record system from 9 health maintenance organizations that comprises about 12 million Americans, about 500,000 of whom are children. So you can then see whether or not those who got the vaccine were more likely to get intussusception than those who didn't. And the answer was yes, they were more likely. And so for that reason, then, RotaShield was taken off the market within a year, frankly, of its being put out there. Another example, I think, of VAERS working is with these current SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. When the mRNA vaccines were given to 1 million people, then 10 million people, then 100 million people, you saw that there was this very rare reports of a relatively rare phenomenon, called this myocardial or heart muscle inflammation. And so again, the question was that causally associated with the vaccine, or was it just coincidentally associated with the vaccine? And when studies were done again, looking at the Vaccine Safety Data Link, it was causally associated. Very rare. I mean, it could be as common in a certain group of young people as 1 in 20,000. A more recent study showed that from just looking at the population as a whole, that if you look at everybody, it was more closer to about 1 in a million. But it was real. That was a real consequence of the vaccine. So VAERS can be useful as sort of a hypothesis generating mechanism, but it's not a hypothesis testing mechanism. You can't tell from VAERS data whether something is causally associated or coincidentally associated. You just can't tell. The only way that can happen is with the vaccine safety data link. So VAERS is constantly misused. That's the biggest problem. People can look on the VAERS website and they'll say, look at all these serious side effects that are being reported following the vaccine, even though we have no idea whether or not they're causally associated. Probably the worst example, and there was one political pundit who in May got on national television and he said there have been 3,300 deaths that have been reported following the vaccine, these SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. That is more than any other vaccine. Well, so take a step back and look at that statement for a second. We know that every day in the United States, roughly 2 per 100,000 people die. By the time this particular political pundit made that statement, the vaccine had been given to 100 million people. That means by definition that there should have been 2,000 people that would have died within 24 hours of receiving the vaccine, 4,000 within 48 hours. Unless the vaccine makes you immortal, which it doesn't. The vaccine doesn't, it only prevents SARS-CoV-2 infections. It doesn't prevent strokes, heart attacks, deaths from cancer, drowning, car accidents. It doesn't do any of that. So the deaths that are reported have to be at least biologically plausibly associated with getting the vaccine. And when these deaths have been investigated, they haven't been. So again, when you see 3,000 deaths reported within, say, 48 hours of getting a vaccine, it's exactly what you would expect if the vaccine wasn't causing any problems, because that's just the background death rate. I mean, the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines don't make you immortal. They only prevent SARS-CoV-2 infections. Probably one of the best examples was Hank Aaron, who was, a baseball slugger who played for the Atlanta Braves, right? Home run champion. He died of a stroke within 2 weeks of getting a vaccine, and a big deal was made of that. I mean, he was 85 years old. 85-year-olds occasionally die from strokes, and that's what happened to him. Had nothing to do with the vaccine. But we're always sort of confusing these temporal associations with causal associations because temporal associations are mostly powerful things. I'll give you a specific example. My wife is a general practitioner. She went into the office on a weekend day, and she was helping the nurse give vaccines. While there was a 4-month-old sitting on her mother's lap, while my wife was drawing the vaccine up into the syringe, hadn't given it yet, while she was drawing it up into the syringe, the 4-month-old had a seizure, went on to have a permanent seizure disorder, epilepsy, and was dead of a chronic neurological disease by age 5. Now, if my wife had given that vaccine 5 minutes earlier, I think there are no amount of statistical data in the world that would have convinced that mother of anything other than the vaccine caused it, right? My child was fine, got a vaccine, had a seizure 5 minutes later, then had epilepsy, and now is dead. I am the mother of a vaccine damaged child, even though that wasn't true. So I think that's I think the biggest challenge for vaccines is when they're given to healthy people, and we have vaccine rates in the 90% range in this country. There are always going to be problems, and there are always going to be problems that are temporally associated. And I think that's the biggest problem with VAERS, is that there are always going to be these temporal associations, and the problem is distinguishing temporal associations from causal associations. And VAERS can't do that. So VAERS is really not a source of information to determine what are real side effects associated with vaccines. Only the vaccine safety data link or other academic studies can do that. So, Dr. Johnson, I'll stop there and take any questions you want me to answer.
Great. Well, goodness, you covered a lot of ground there, Dr. Offit. I think I want to go back first to, as we talked about the approval, the EUA and the FDA approval. So I think what some of the things that we keep hearing from people is that they're concerned about how the vaccines were developed. They felt that there were shortcuts in the process. Can you just kind of talk about the way these vaccines were developed as opposed to other vaccines, and the safety of these vaccines compared to other vaccines that we typically have no question about?
Right. So here's the way you would typically develop a vaccine. And I would say the average length of time for development of a vaccine is about 15 years. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that created the bovine human reassortant rotavirus vaccine, Rototec. That took 26 years. Here, in this case, The virus was isolated, SARS-CoV-2 was isolated and sequenced in January of 2020. We had a vaccine 11 months later. There were two large clinical trials that were presented to the FDA in December, but those trials have been completed by November. So that's remarkably fast. And I think reasonable person who looks at that thinks there must have been timelines that were cut, timelines that were shortened, or worse, vaccine safety guidelines that were ignored. But let me tell you what the difference was here versus previously. Usually what happens is you do preclinical studies, meaning you do studies in experimental animals like mice or non-human primates to make sure that this idea that you have, a messenger RNA vaccine or a vectored virus vaccine like the J&J vaccine, is at least safe in experimental animals. That was done. Then you go to phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are dose-ranging studies. So now you have your idea for how you want to do it. Say you have an mRNA vaccine. Do I give it at 10 micrograms? Do I give it at 30 micrograms? Do I give it at 100 micrograms? What dose induces an immune response that I think is going to correlate with protection? Usually those studies involve about 100 people, typically. That was done here, so that wasn't different. What became different was from that point on. Normally what you would do is you would go to a phase 2 study where now you have your dose and you have your dosing interval. In this case, let's say for Pfizer was three weeks. Then you tested in 400 people, 500 people to make sure you're consistently immunogenic. That was pretty much truncated, where you went right to phase 3. And phase 3 is now you have your dose, you have your dosing interval, and you do a large clinical trial where you give tens of thousands of people the vaccine, tens of thousands of people get a placebo, meaning salt water, so they serve as your control, and then you see what happens. That was done more quickly because basically the government took the risk of vaccine development out of it for most of these pharmaceutical companies. So normally companies go slowly because they're basically making a progressively bigger bet in terms of the amount of money they're spending. And to do a phase 3 trial costs several $100 million. I mean, the phase 3 trial for the rotavirus vaccine I was involved in was a 70,000 child prospective placebo-controlled 11 country 4-year $350 million trial. Obviously the company paid for that. Here, for the most part, the government paid for it. So the government took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies, and that's what sped it up more than anything else. The so-called Operation Warp Speed, which was a brainchild of Peter Marks, who obviously was a fan of Star Trek, that was what made this so much quicker. Also, when companies make a vaccine, they do phase 2, phase 3, and then if it looks promising in phase 3, then they build a building and then they mass produce. That also was different here. What happened was the minute phase 3 trials started, vaccines were getting mass produced. And the government was willing to spend billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, to say that if this doesn't work in a phase 3 trial, we'll just throw away these doses. Well, on the other hand, if it does work, we'll be able to have vaccines the minute we find out that it works. So that's what made it so fast. Basically, the government took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies and just moved things along by basically doing mass producing at the same time phase 3 trials were done. No company would ever do that. Pfizer, to its credit, did this on their own. The research was not paid for by the federal government. The mass production was not paid for by the federal government, and the phase 3 trials were also not paid for by the federal government. On the other hand, the product was paid for by the federal government, so they essentially had a guaranteed market. But I don't think people should worry that in any sense safety guidelines were truncated, because they weren't. I mean, all the safety problems that have occurred with the vaccine occur within 6 weeks of dose, and that was, I think, where Stephen Hahn, as an FDA commissioner, stood up last year when there was a lot of pressure on him to release that vaccine before the November 3rd election. He didn't do that. He said, I want 2 months of safety data after dose 2, which then pushed that vaccine to after the November 3rd election so that we could know for a fact that it didn't have at least any uncommon side effects. And we now know post-approval that it has some very, very, very rare side effects, which is true of any medical product. Really, there's not a medical product out there that has a positive effect that doesn't have a negative effect. And if something doesn't have a negative effect, it probably never had a positive effect. So it's true of every vaccine. I mean, the oral polio vaccine, Albert Sabin's oral polio vaccine, which we used in this country from the early 1960s up until 2000, was a very rare cause itself of polio. I mean, 1 out of every 2.4 million doses was complicated by polio. I mean, although we eliminated polio from this country by the late 1970s, every year 6 to 8 children would get polio from the polio vaccine, which is why we eventually abandoned that the year 2000 and went back to Jonas Salk's inactivated polio vaccine. Measles-containing vaccine can cause thrombocytopenia, a lowering of the platelet count, which you usually see about 2 weeks after the dose. And it's usually pretty transient without sequelae, but that certainly does happen. The squalene adjuvanted influenza vaccine that was used primarily in Europe in 2009 was itself a very rare cause of narcolepsy, occurring in about 1 in 50,000 people. And these things are only become clear when you vaccinate millions of people. And also we know that the Guillain-Barré syndrome is a very, very rare consequence of the influenza vaccine, occurring occasionally in 1 per million people. But all of these, for the most part, phenomenon are often also seen following the natural infection, which is true here as well. I mean, the wild-type virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus itself causes myocarditis at a much more commonly than following the vaccine. SARS-CoV-2 virus also causes blood clots, including blood clots in the brain at rates several-fold higher than occurs with a vaccine. So again, there are no risk-free choices, but I think that we can take solace in the fact that although the timelines were shortened here, we were able to get a remarkable vaccine in a very short period of time. I mean, I'm on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. We were told by Dr. Fauci very early on that if we had at least could have efficacy of 50% with a lower bound of 30%, that still would be a worthwhile product in the midst of a pandemic. These vaccines, the initial vaccines, after at least a few months of efficacy, had efficacy in greater than 90% and are remarkably safe and save your life. And so it is very, very, very frustrating for me that there is still a substantial percentage of this population that is choosing not to get a vaccine that not only will save their life, but save the lives of people with whom they come in contact when they're infected.
Great, Dr. Offit. I think it's really important for people to hear, again, how the vaccines were developed and all of the steps that were taken. And I think your comparison with other vaccines and, the incredible safety profile that we've seen with these vaccines that, we've never seen before. And we have experienced, we have, as you said, hundreds of millions of doses of these vaccines that have been given. And we've had an opportunity to see what those rare side effects would be. We also, I think, really important that you've mentioned, I think a lot of people forget that these side effects that we're seeing and others occur when you get COVID-19. I think there's still some that are unconvinced at how serious COVID-19 can be, and the fact that these side effects are much more common and much more severe if you actually get COVID-19. So I think really important that you made that distinction so that people can, get a better understanding. One of the other questions I want to ask, I think some of the hesitancy we've seen were around reproductive concerns. And as a former OBGYN and speaking to a lot of my colleagues, we have seen the devastation that occurs when pregnant women get COVID-19. And we know that in terms of the mechanism of these vaccines, there should be no indication of effect on your future fertility. Can you speak a little bit more about just those fertility concerns that come up?
Yeah, so let me tell you where this false notion was born and why it is that we know it's not true. There was a letter written to something called the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, which is essentially the FDA equivalent in Europe. It was written by 2 researchers who claimed that the SARS-CoV-2 surface protein, which is the protein that you're making antibodies against when you're vaccinated, was genetically very similar to a protein that sits on the surface of placental cells, a protein called syncytin-1. So that therefore, if you're making an immune response to the SARS-CoV-2 surface or spike protein, you're also inadvertently making an immune response to your own placenta. That was the thinking. Now, in truth, those 2 proteins are distinct. They're immunologically distinct. To say that they have similar sequences is to say that you and I have the same social security number because they both contain the number 5. They were distinct. Secondly, there were, the second piece of evidence arguing against this was that there were 36 pregnancies during the phase 3 trials. So remember, the phase 3 trials are done where tens of thousands of people get a vaccine or tens of thousands of people get a placebo. So if there were 36 pregnancies and this vaccine affects fertility, then you would have expected most, if not all of those pregnancies would have been in the placebo group, right? Because in theory, the vaccine is lessening your capacity to be fertile. But in fact, it was equally divided. There were 18 cases of pregnancy, or not cases of pregnancy, there were 18 instances of pregnancy in the vaccine group and 18 instances of pregnancy in the placebo group. So the vaccine didn't enhance or lessen fertility. Also, if you're making the claim that antibodies directed against SARS-CoV-2 surface protein are also negatively affecting your placenta, remember, you make antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 protein where you're naturally infected because you're infected with the virus and the virus has SARS-CoV-2 spike protein on it. Well, if that's true, how many people have been infected over the last year and a half? About 100 million in the United States, roughly, have been infected. Well, so if that's the case, then what's happened to the birth rate? I mean, if the antibodies directed against SARS-CoV-2 surface protein are negatively affecting the placenta, then the birth rate should have gone down dramatically. In fact, it stayed the same. So that's your next piece of information that suggests that this was all nonsense. And although this is probably the most frequently asked question I get, it's just nonsense. Unfortunately, it's really hard to unring the bell. It is hard to unscare people. So now I've given you information why this isn't true, but still some people, you have this in their head now. I mean, so I'll give you an example of that. There was born in the 1970s the notion that kids would go trick-or-treating and they would get a candy apple, and that the candy apple was found to, in some cases, contain a razor blade. Right? I mean, that was the thing that was born. Razor blade in the candy apple, okay? So it was completely an urban myth. It never happened. It was just utter nonsense. Nonetheless, I think if you send your children out trick-or-treating, they come back with a candy apple from a house that you don't know, but you don't know who lives there, and your child is about to take a bite into that candy apple, you're nervous. It's just hard to get past these negative things. It's just hard to unring the bell. And it's very, very frustrating. And that's how the anti-vaccine groups work. They just throw stuff out there. They know that some of it's going to stick. And it's very easy to scare people.
Great. And again, as we talked about before, with COVID-19, the side effects, the long-term consequences are increased. And so that, getting a vaccine is going to decrease those risks. I think that women had been concerned about miscarriages and such with the vaccine. And I think that what we've seen is that the risks with COVID-19, again, is more than your risks in general. And so that I think people lose that when they're concerned about the vaccine. As you mentioned before, the long-term side effects from vaccines have been apparent within a short period of time. And so that I think that we have heard from people, well, I want to know 10 years down the line what's going to occur. I think that people don't fully understand how vaccines work and the fact that the components of the vaccine are not in you for a long period of time. I think that a lot of the questions that we get seem that people don't really understand that concept.
Yeah, I think the pregnancy issue is an important one. What do we know? We know for certain that women who are pregnant that are then infected with this virus are several times more likely to suffer severe and occasionally fatal illness, meaning more likely to enter the hospital, more likely to go to the ICU, more likely to be ventilated, and more likely to die, and more likely to deliver their child prematurely than women who are pregnant, women of the same age who are not pregnant. So we need a vaccine for pregnant women. What's interesting is when the phase 3 trials were done, they really didn't include pregnant women. There were 36 pregnancies that happened to occur, but really the companies were trying to avoid giving the vaccine to pregnant women, which is unfortunate because pregnant women certainly were at greater risk, and it would have been nice to have studied them early on. But what the CDC did, which is unusual because they never do this, is when a particular group is not studied, in this case the pregnant women were not studied, they will make that vaccine a contraindication for giving it in pregnancy because there are no data. They didn't do that here. What they did was they said a woman could reasonably choose to get a vaccine, knowing that the vaccine was likely to be safe and knowing that women who were pregnant were at high risk of getting severe disease. And so what happened then through a system called the V-Safe mechanism is when thousands and then tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of women did make that choice, you were able then to follow those women who were pregnant who got the vaccine and compare them to women who were pregnant who didn't get the vaccine to see whether or not there were any differences in those two groups, any differences in terms of maternal complications, any differences in terms of fetal outcome. And there were no differences. And when that was shown and was then published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the CDC took the next step and said, we recommend this vaccine for pregnant women. So, it's the story that I hear the most, frankly, that is the most upsetting, because it sort of gets to the question of when people say it's my personal choice whether or not to get a vaccine. A friend of mine called me the other day, and this is not an unusual story, and she said that her stepson had chosen not to get a vaccine. He then got COVID. He then transmitted that virus to his wife, who was pregnant. She then got COVID. She then, because she was pregnant, ended up going to the hospital, ended up going to the ICU, ended up getting ventilated, and ended up delivering their child severely prematurely. So this man who made a decision not to vaccinate himself also made a decision for his wife and also made a decision for his unborn child. These are not personal decisions. And that's sort of the part of this when people make that claim that I find the most upsetting. This is a contagious illness. It is not your right to catch and transmit a potentially fatal virus to somebody else. That is not your personal decision any more than it's your personal decision to run a stop sign at an intersection.
Well, thanks, Dr. Offit, for making that point. I think that, people are not really focused on the fact that, as you say, this virus can be transmitted to those people who are vulnerable and have impacts that we don't even think about. They can be far-reaching as well in terms of impacting people that are quite a distance away from you. Another thing I want to talk about is that, these vaccines have been very safe, very effective in preventing death and hospitalization from COVID. But as we see the prevalence of the Delta variant, I think that there are a lot of concerns about, how effective is my vaccine? Knowing that the Delta seems to be so highly transmissible, and there are cases where people who have been vaccinated can still get infected with the virus. Talk about that, the differences in the infection when you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, and just generally the fact that we're vaccinated. Talk a little bit about the protection that we still have, even in face of the Delta variant.
Right. So the goal of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, the COVID vaccine, is to prevent serious illness, the kind of illness that causes you to have to seek medical attention, have to go to the hospital, have to go to the ICU, or die. That's the goal. And really, frankly, that's the goal of most vaccines. As would be expected over time, the level of neutralizing antibodies in your bloodstream, virus-specific antibodies in your bloodstream, will decline. That has to happen. In addition, and because of that, there will be a greater incidence over time in asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection. That's okay. I think that the goal, again, is to prevent serious illness. Whether it's the first variant that came out of China, the so-called D614G variant, or the second variant that sort of took over, the Alpha variant, and now the third variant that's taken over, the Delta variant, in all cases, the vaccine, which were really developed against the first strain, still work very well at preventing serious illness. With the Delta variant, it works a little less well against preventing disease, either asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection. But again, that's okay. There was one Republican senator recently, actually, who was fully vaccinated. He then contracted SARS-CoV-2, COVID, and he had mild respiratory symptoms. He had a mild sinusitis, and he correctly said, it would have been much worse if I hadn't been vaccinated. That's exactly the right way to look at it. And I think one of the communication errors we've made, with this vaccine is by referring to asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection as a breakthrough illness. That is not a breakthrough infection. A breakthrough infection is when you, despite being fully vaccinated, are nonetheless hospitalized. That's a breakthrough infection. And I think we set an expectation for this vaccine that was unrealistic, because when people hear the word breakthrough, they think reasonably failure, and it's really not a failure. I mean, for example, if you take this outbreak in July in Massachusetts, in Provincetown, Massachusetts, thousands of men get together, celebrate July 4th. They have a sort of indoor activities in which many people didn't wear masks. And although 79% of people in that group were vaccinated, there was an outbreak. So 346 people who were fully vaccinated nonetheless developed COVID. So what percentage of them were hospitalized? And the answer was about 1.2%, 4 of 346 people. That's a vaccine that's continuing to work. And I think, so that was the Lambda variant, that was the Delta variant, that was in July, which is recently. I think we should take heart in those kinds of findings.
Great, thanks. Again, I think that message really needs to go out that the risks that we have right now are for those that are unvaccinated. So we still need to get more people vaccinated for protection. And those people who have already been vaccinated have really good protection. And I think that message really needs to resonate with people. People really need to understand that getting vaccinated in the first place is one of the best tools that we have against COVID. I'm going to pause here and bring up a couple of questions that have come through in our emails. We sent out a request for questions, and we have a couple of questions here that we'd like you to answer, if you could, Dr. Offit. So the first is from a person who says, if my immune system is exposed daily to the virus, and with the help of the vaccine, I'm able to avoid becoming ill, does that mean that my immune system is getting better at recognizing and battling the virus? Am I continuing to build antibodies after each exposure? Does the immune system use these exposures to get better at recognizing and fighting COVID, or is protection based solely on the vaccine?
Well, certainly when you're vaccinated, you have excellent protection against serious illness. And to some extent, decent protection against mild or asymptomatic disease. The question is a good one. I mean, if you're in a world, and we are in that world now, where the virus is continuing to circulate, and you are vaccinated, I mean, is it true that when you come in contact with, say, someone who's infected, and you develop, let's say, an asymptomatic infection, so you never knew about it, but the virus reproduced itself a little bit in your body, not enough to cause disease, but enough to boost your immune system? Yes, I think it probably does boost your immune system over time. So yeah, it's true for pretty much all diseases. I mean, people worried about that with chickenpox when we basically started to eliminate chickenpox. Would that put people at risk of more commonly of getting shingles, which is a reactivation of a chickenpox infection, because they weren't constantly being boosted with just the chickenpox virus out there? That didn't work out that way. But you're right. I think that you probably do get boosted. But it's a good thing you're getting vaccinated, because that's the key here. I mean, if we're going to get on top of this pandemic, and we can get on top of this pandemic, we need to vaccinate people who are unvaccinated. You look at us as compared to Canada, which is just across the border there, where we have 27 cases per 100,000 people. They have 2 cases per 100,000 people because they have a much higher vaccination rate in their population. We can get on top of this virus, but we're choosing not to do it. I mean, I am a child of the 1950s. I mean, I watched the development of the polio vaccine. I was a little boy, but I mean, that happened in my lifetime. Polio virus was the enemy. I mean, we created the March of Dimes to do research, to create vaccines, to get them out there. Polio was the enemy. Polio virus had no friends. That's not true here. SARS-CoV-2 virus has a great many friends. People who prohibit mask mandates, people who stand up and say, I don't want to get a vaccine, science denialists, vaccine denialists, conspiracy theorists. Those are all friends of SARS-CoV-2 virus. I never thought I would witness something like that in my lifetime, in the midst of a pandemic, but here we are.
Thank you for that, Dr. Offit. So the other question is an immunocompromised person put at higher risk by another person living in the same household receiving the COVID vaccine? And this is something that we've really heard quite a bit.
No, they're put at lower risk. I mean, if you're in the home of somebody who's immune compromised, you want to put a moat around them of people who are vaccinated, because that makes it more difficult for the virus to get across that moat into the person who's less able to develop an immune response from a vaccine. This is true for all vaccines. I mean, when someone's immune compromised in the home, you need to protect them by making sure everyone they come in contact with is vaccinated, assuming they can't be successfully vaccinated. So that's your responsibility. frankly. I mean, it's very frustrating for me. I was on service last week at Children's Hospital Philadelphia. We saw a number of children who came into our hospital, and it was frustrating in two ways. One, if a child was less than 12, you knew that they couldn't be vaccinated, but the parents could be, and often the parents weren't. Also frustrating were the 12 to 17-year-old who came in, who also weren't vaccinated, but could be vaccinated. So it's just, there's so many things in medicine we don't know. There's so many things in medicine we can't do. This we know. Specific germs cause specific diseases. You can prevent those germs with a vaccine. And now we have a vaccine. It's just remarkable that we choose to ignore it.
So on that question, I think that there still is some misconception that there is something from a vaccinated person that could be transmitted to someone else. And so that, can you speak to the vaccine components and the fact that you aren't able to get COVID from a vaccine and that there's no transmissible elements from someone who is vaccinated?
Right. I think there was actually an institution in Florida that prohibited teachers who had been vaccinated to come into the class because they were scared that somehow they would transmit the virus or something to children who would come in contact with a vaccinated person. So let me tell you why it is that doesn't make a bit of sense. Whether it's the mRNA vaccines or it's the vectored virus vaccines, they all have the same final pathway, which is messenger RNA. So it's a small piece of genetic material that educates your cell on how to make a particular protein. In this case, the messenger RNA for the COVID vaccines is the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So what happens is the mRNA enters the cytoplasm of your cells, which is outside the nucleus, where it proceeds to join 200,000 other small pieces of messenger RNA that are there making a variety of proteins and enzymes so that you can live. This is now just another protein that cells are making. The mRNA makes those proteins for a few days and then degrades. But this is how all the proteins in your body are made. So the notion that you would catch something from this is the same thing as if your body makes insulin every day. Your body makes growth hormone every day. Your body makes hemoglobin every day. It's like, thinking I don't want to stand next to somebody because I might catch their hemoglobin or insulin or growth hormone. It's not going to happen. It just doesn't work that way. So it is amazing how the level of myths and misinformation start to reach the level of parity after a while.
So the last question, with your experience and, taking care of pediatric patients, I think that, some of the myths that we've heard is that kids can't get COVID or COVID is not dangerous for kids. Tell us a little bit of what you're seeing in terms of kids with COVID.
Well, at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, we are experiencing what is happening nationwide, which is we're seeing more and more kids getting admitted. I mean, now children make up, something like 14 to 18% of the cases that are out there. I mean, when the virus came into this country, the mantra which was correct was that you are at greater risk if you're an older person. And that's true. I mean, roughly 93% of the deaths were in people who were over 55. But we've been pretty good about vaccinating older people. Now the cases are in the less than 50-year-old. And certainly, although it was true that children get infected less frequently or less severely, that didn't mean they couldn't be infected or they couldn't be infected severely. I mean, there are now, tens of thousands of children who have been hospitalized. There are at least 400 children who have died of this virus. Children also get a phenomenon called MIS-C, multi-system inflammatory disease, which is frightening to watch. It's sort of this multi-system vasculitis, meaning inflammation of the blood vessels caused by this virus. So this virus can cause children to suffer. It can cause them to be hospitalized. It can cause them to die. And we have a COVID ward at our hospital. And if you can prevent that and you can prevent it safely, then prevent it. What really worries me in this is that only about 30% of I think on a nationwide level, of children between 12 and 17 are vaccinated. They are an under-vaccinated group for which a vaccine is available. And I don't know what the holdup is for parents here. And I worry that same holdup is going to happen when this vaccine becomes available for the 5 to 12-year-old. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Offit. I think you've provided us some great insights and great depth of knowledge on COVID and on vaccines. Are there any things that we didn't talk about or any last words that you want to make sure that people really get about these vaccines and about COVID?
No, I think we can get out of this pandemic. We have our golden ticket out of this pandemic, and that's a vaccine. There is no good reason not to get a vaccine, just a lot of bad reasons. So get it. Protect yourself, protect those with whom you come in contact with, and we can end this and we can go back to life as we lived it before this pandemic, but not until that happens.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Offit. And I just want to echo what you said. We've got 3 safe and effective vaccines that hundreds of millions of people have gotten. We know that they are effective now, even in the face of the Delta variant and the increases in cases that we're seeing, the hospitalizations, and even the deaths are of people who are unvaccinated when vaccines are available. So as Dr. Offit said, we do have the power to end this, and getting vaccinated is the key. And if you need additional information, we've got information on our website, pa.gov/COVID or healthpa.gov. Lots of information available. Talk to your healthcare provider if you need additional information. And vaccines are freely available all over the Commonwealth. So get vaccinated, get the information that you need, and let's get out of this pandemic. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Offit. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you all. Thanks.